A guard too. God, no, God, no.
So much for joining us today at our Booksellers for this amazing event. Tonight, we're going to be in discussion with Cynthia McFadden and Chris Whipple on Chris's new book, Uncharted, How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. Uncharted takes a deep dive through the history-making 2024 presidential election. With incredible details, esteemed White House historian and political analyst Chris Whipple chronicles the unprecedented drama as it unfolds, documenting the true story of the Harris and Trump campaigns and the difficult, urgent decisions made in the backrooms of power with the future of American democracy at stake. Chris Whipple is a New York Times bestselling author and widely acclaimed documentary filmmaker, speaker, as well as a Peabody and Emmy Award-winning journalist. He appears throughout the media and contributes to the New York Times and Washington Post, and has written for Vanity Fair, Politico, and the Daily Beast, among others. And joining us in conversation tonight is award-winning journalist Cynthia McFadden. She has been among the nation's leading broadcast journalists for nearly 4 decades. She was formerly the co-anchor of ABC's Nightline, and more recently was the senior investigative and legal correspondent at NBC News. I'm going to hand it over to them now and enjoy.
We have to start meeting.
Listen,
It's been a while.
well, it's been a while. Chris and I have known each other for 30 years. We worked together at ABC. He was really under the control of Diane Sawyer. Some of us tried to get on his dance list.
He was my favorite.
Thank you very much. I hope this is being recorded. But honestly, Chris is one of the rare people in the world of journalism who, in fact, excels in every format we have. He writes books, he produces documentaries, he now has become a fixture on television himself. And his reputation is well earned. It doesn't surprise any of us who know you, Chris, that you have debuted this book at number 4 on the New York Times bestseller. And my favorite part about your background is that you were once a foreign correspondent for Life magazine and was in some really interesting and dangerous spots, which we can talk about at another time. So what I want to say is good evening, book lovers and political junkies. I hope you're all friends because you're really wedged in there tonight. So we are going to put our political differences aside perhaps for the evening. I think the basic idea is we're going to talk for about half an hour, maybe a little bit more, and then we'll open it up to questions for all of you. We'll have you out of here by, and leave time to buy books. And Chris has signed some of them, and I'm sure he'll personalize those of you who would like those done too. Chris, you have a couple people you want to thank before we get going.
Yes, I do. So before I say a word about Cynthia, I just want to shout out to a couple of people. My dearest childhood friend, Donna Hawkins Parsons, who has brought half the town of Madison with her. No surprise. And my beautiful wife, Carrie Fagan. In the back. She is virtually a co-author of this book. She does most of the work and I just write it. So. About Cynthia, she is one of the great interviewers of our era. She's really the best, and with the most fun to work with. I kid you not, in my previous iteration as a television producer. I will say about her interviewing ability that just one thing, which is that I did an interview with Charlie Rose this afternoon, and he's the warm-up.
Right, I'll take that. We won't go any further into Charlie Rose. That was really interesting. Wow. Well, let's start at the beginning. Why the book? Why this book? How did it happen?
So the truth is that I was writing a completely different book. It was about presidential campaign managers from 1968 to the present for HarperCollins, when suddenly Joe Biden dropped out of the race that fateful weekend of July 21. I realized at that moment, this was the political story of the century. However you felt about it, one way or the other. I called my boss at HarperCollins and said, I think we should put this book aside and I should do the story of the wildest what promised to be the wildest campaign in history, and the result is the book. And it's wilder and stranger. I mean, we all lived through it. We all know how wild it was, but it is even wilder and stranger behind closed doors.
Well, you did it at warp speed too. I mean, you had to get this book out sooner rather than later.
I did. I mean, the first thing I said to my boss at HarperCollins was, "We need to do this book," and I said, "And fast." And she told me how fast, and I said, "Are you sure?" Anyway, it was a race.
So the book is jam-packed with both named and unnamed sources. About how many people did you talk to in the course of writing the book?
I would say dozens. It's hard to calculate. Carrie could probably tell you. She transcribed every interview. But the key to it was really the reason, and the other reason I did the book was that I thought I was uniquely qualified to do it, not because I'm smarter than anybody else, but because I had access to Joe Biden's inner circle, Donald Trump's closest advisors, and I thought I had a pretty good shot at Kamala Harris's world as well. And in the end, I got to them as well. So, to me, it's never really the number of interviews. It's whom did you get, who really knows?
Well, you got some amazing people go on the record with you. We'll get to Ron Klein in just a moment. But first, here's the big pitch, guys. Based on your reporting, is there any doubt in your mind that Joe Biden mental acuity had been severely compromised by the spring of 2024?
This is really the mystery at the heart of the book. I don't subscribe to the Karl Rove theory that this was a gigantic conspiracy with Joe Biden incapacitated in the corner and somebody else running the country. Joe Biden was not Woodrow Wilson. We all know the story of Wilson being sidelined with a massive stroke and his wife Edith running the White House way back in the day. This was not that case. It was stranger and equally troubling. But what it really was, I mean, we all knew, just as observers, I think from afar, that Joe Biden was too old to run for re-election in 2024, much less govern effectively at the age of 86. The astonishing thing is that no one in Joe Biden's inner circle ever sat him down and had the conversation. Listen, boss, are you sure you're up to this? The extent to which Joe Biden's inner circle was in a fog of delusion and denial is astonishing.
Well, so was it a cover-up, Chris, in the sense that they actually understood just how incapacitated he was and decided either collectively or individually to cover it up? Or was it they really had, as you suggest, deluded themselves, or a combination of both?
It's a little of both. I mean, I think you have to separate campaigning from governing to some extent. Now, I tell a story in the book that was stunning to me when I heard it. A Democratic campaign veteran operative from the 2020 campaign came to the White House in spring of 2024 to interview for a top job in the 2024 campaign. Joe Biden was there, all of his key aides, and the conversation took this unexpectedly candid turn when one of the aides said to this person, "Listen, in 2020, we had this great excuse of COVID. We could hide him in the basement. What do we do now?" So that will tell you to what extent they knew, everybody knew around Biden, that he was incapable of campaigning in any effective way. And so they were certainly hiding him on the campaign trail. The distinction I'd make is between campaigning and governing, because if you want to believe in this gigantic conspiracy, there are a few inconvenient facts. Number one, senators, including Dick Blumenthal, my friend who was supposed to be here tonight, couldn't make it, went to see Biden after being in the Middle East, and Biden sat there and gave them master class understanding every nuance of Middle Eastern diplomacy, by all accounts. On the day, that fateful weekend of July 2021, that Sunday morning when he put out the statement.
Abdicated, I like that better, yeah.
When Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donelon, his two key advisors, came to sit down and bat out that statement with him, he was on the phone that morning, parsing every detail of a multi-nation prisoner swap. So you can't say that he was incapacitated or unable to govern completely. He clearly was able to do that. What he couldn't do was campaign. And that was certainly a cover-up. And I'll tell you why I personally, I had good reason to suspect something was up when I was writing my first book on Biden, called The Fight of His Life, on the first 2 years. I asked for an interview and I was told, sure, email your questions and you will get written responses.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of anything like that in the White House before. And I did, but that told me that they were not comfortable with the notion of Biden answering questions in real time with a reporter in the room. They weren't going to go there.
You know, it is a little bit hard though, when you say, okay, he wasn't capable of running, but he was capable of governing. And while I understand that in certain pools, he was very effective still. Come on, it's like, how do they, you talk about, and because you have some real experience in writing about the chiefs of staff, you talk about what happens when you get in the White House to the people who work there. And I think that's vital to understanding how they were able, if your theory is correct, how they were able to persuade themselves he was capable.
It was absolutely staggering delusion and denial, as I say, on the part of some of Biden's closest aides. And when I asked Bill Daley, Obama's second White House chief of staff, knew all these guys. He went to the White House a dozen times during this period. Not once did anybody say, hey, why don't you pop in and say hello to the president? He kept saying, and he saw Biden at St. Patrick's Day party at the White House in 2024, and Biden was reading off a teleprompter and to a small group of, and Daley said, if you need a teleprompter to talk to a few Irish guys, you really got a problem.
Because that was not Joe Biden.
Yeah, what the blank is going on, he would say. And I asked Daley afterwards to explain this to me. How is it possible that Biden's closest advisors couldn't see what he, Daley, saw clearly? And he said to me, you're in the bubble. You've crossed the Rubicon. He was trying to explain what it's like to breathe that rarefied air of the West Wing and to be captivated by it. I asked my friend Jack Watson, who was Jimmy Carter's last chief of staff, really brilliant guy. And he said, you know, it's like being in a magnetic force field. The gravitational pull when you're one of those advisors is so intense, the impulse to protect the president at all costs. All I can tell you is, and we can talk about Ron Klain. Ron Klain is a great example of somebody who really should have known better. A really smart, politically savvy guy who fought an 11th hour battle behind closed doors to keep Biden on the ticket.
Right, and that is particularly gasp-worthy once you've read the book and Ron Klein's moment by moment. He was in charge of debate prep, and his moment by moment account to you of what was happening at Camp David as they tried to prepare President Biden for that first fateful debate is so shocking. And then when you say, when it came down, push came to shove, he was the dude saying to Biden, no way, do not step down. So
Yeah,
tell us about the
Ron Klain is in the doghouse with Joe Biden at the moment because he completely spilled the beans on the record to me about day by day, but hour by hour, the debate prep at Camp David that nobody had talked about up to this point. Interestingly, Steven Spielberg and Jeffrey Katzenberg were involved in the debate prep. They had a Zoom call with Biden before he went out there to coach him. Spielberg had coached Biden for the State of the Union address when he hit it out of the park. Remember when he
Right.
owned the
Right.
MAGA hecklers who tried to.
I had never heard
Shout
that.
him
Had
down.
you, any of you heard that before? I had not heard that before.
So anyway, you know what, it's full of details like that. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, I've never read this before. So I basically, you know, my rule of thumb is write stuff you didn't know before you.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Anyway, Klain proceeded to tell me about blow by blow. I mean, Biden arrived and Klain was shocked by his condition. He was not just exhausted, he was out of it. He couldn't really follow the back and forth between the campaigns. He was obsessed with two foreign leaders, Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz. And he kept saying, they think I'm doing a great job. I must be a great president. He, at one point, wandered off, just walked out of Aspen Lodge to the pool, sank into a lounge chair and fell sound asleep in the middle of the debate prep. At one point, he said to Ron, hey, I've got an idea. And Klain said, what's that? He said, if I look perplexed when the cutaways, or when Trump is talking during the debate, they'll think he's an idiot. To which Klain replied, sir, if you look perplexed, people are just going to think you're perplexed. And that's the problem we have in this race. So anyway, now Biden, Klain described this whole, and I could go on. I mean, you pick up the book if you, I won't keep you all night, but it was, again, Biden was out of it. He was unprepared. And of course, one of the arguments against the notion that this was a gigantic conspiracy that everybody knew Biden couldn't govern or perform is that you would never send this guy onto a stage to debate Donald Trump if you knew he was incapacitated. I mean, that would be crazy, but they did it. It was a kind of Hail Mary. They were hoping for a State of the Union performance, that maybe he would just miraculously recreate that evening. And also at this point in the race, look, if it were a cover-up, if they absolutely knew he couldn't do it, then it was crazy to send him out. They could have run the clock out and had the debate in the fall. The Biden campaign insisted on an early debate.
Right,
In the
remember
summer.
that, it was the Biden folks who demanded.
They were the ones that
right.
demanded it, and part of the reason was that they felt they needed to turn the election from a referendum on Joe Biden to a contrast with the crazy guy, Donald Trump. That was the whole reasoning for having this debate now. We've got to change the terms of the debate. It has to be that everybody is afraid of the crazy madman and not a referendum on Joe Biden.
Don't you think it's also the case that they started thinking about can we win, not should he govern? And in fact, several people say to you in the course of the book that they were feeling that, you know, it was an attempt to dislodge sort of the old democratic values, the old, the way things were, and that they weren't going to let that happen. It wasn't about Joe Biden's age. It was about all these whippersnappers in the party who were trying to come in and that kind of thing. So there was a sense of hanging on to what there was.
Well, there was also just hubris. I mean, this was a bunch of people, including Joe Biden, who were convinced that everybody underestimated Biden in 2020. Nobody thought he could win. He was declared dead and buried after New Hampshire. He finished 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire. Everyone pronounced his political death, and he rose and won South Carolina and the rest, and wound up in the White House. So their attitude was, we know what we're doing. Thank you very much, and never mind, well, you people who hate us.
I think you've made an enemy of George Clooney by writing this book. There is a very, I don't know what the right adjective is. It would actually shock me, a story about George Clooney having wrote the letters urging the president to step down, that he had a shouting match with the folks who run Morning Joe. Tell us about that.
So you may recall that on July 10, well, George Clooney had been to a fundraiser in Hollywood and thought that Biden was a shell of himself, was really concerned. He published a devastating op-ed in the New York Times on July 10. Speculation was that he had gone to Barack Obama for a green light to publish this. And anyway, so the next day on Morning Joe, Mika Brzezinski goes on this kind of riff, this really surprising riff, in which she accuses Clooney of having collaborated with, having gotten the green light from Barack Obama. And so afterwards, a person connected with Morning Joe, who shall remain nameless, walked into his apartment, his phone lit up. It was George Clooney, and Clooney proceeded to lace into him in an F-bomb laden rant for a good 5 minutes, hung up, called him back again. F you, F yourself, F you, you were supposed to be my friend. Clooney went absolutely ballistic. And by the way, just an interesting footnote to all of this. I mean, you can make what you will of Clooney's thin-skinned reaction to Mika Brzezinski saying this. I was supposed to be on Morning Joe the morning of Pub Date, and I was bumped. They told me, they said it was because of the stock market crash. But we're not so sure. Are there really coincidences? That's where-
I just, this though, I totally understand why Clooney was so upset. Why was he, what made him so angry? The suggestion that he had to go to Papa Obama for
Yeah,
the.
I think it was the suggestion that he was Obama's puppet somehow. And but again, you could, why that explosive, really off the wall reaction that went on and on? Maybe that tells you something about whether he had in fact, it's for readers to judge.
So, let's talk a little bit about, since we're on President Obama, his relationship. I think there's some very shocking details about the relationship between the Obamas and the Bidens in the book as well.
It's just a fascinating relationship between Obama and Biden. Very complicated, many layers to it. They were very close, and they bonded over when Biden's son, was dying of cancer, and he was VP. Obama offered to write a check for all of his medical treatment. He really took Biden under his wing. But at the same time, by that time, Biden had never forgiven Obama for having put his thumb on the scale for Hillary Clinton as the nominee in 2016. That was a deep wound that Biden has never recovered from, and which he has always held against Obama. Now fast forward to the final days of the campaign, well, of Biden's campaign before he dropped out. The walls were closing in. I'm told, again, this is why this story is Shakespearean and full of betrayals and backstabbing and high stakes and ending in tragedy. What happened as the walls closed in, according to Biden's best friend, he told me the thing that really bothered Joe Biden wasn't that devastating op-ed by Clooney. It was the fact that Barack Obama never picked up the phone and called Joe Biden and said, "Hey, Joe, you sure you're up to this?" And shared his reservations. Instead, he was working behind the scenes to force Biden out.
And when you report, when Biden did step down, Barack Obama never called him. That's surprising.
Yeah.
So, by the way, is there a definitive answer to why on July 21st he made or the 20th, he made the decision to make? What, it was the one thing?
Yeah, I think it was Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leaders in the end. What happened was that Saturday, Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donelon came to the house. Steve Ricchetti walked Biden through the polls and said, look, there's a path. It's a narrow path. There's a path that you could, which was delusional, I think. But anyway, he told him there was it, but it would be brutal and bloody because the Democratic Party leaders had turned on Biden. And come Monday morning, in all likelihood, the party leaders would have gone public. They'd been private up to this point. And I tell the story of how Nancy Pelosi, this hadn't been reported anywhere else. The reporting was that she had called Biden and had a conversation about getting out. In truth, she went secretly, had this clandestine meeting with Biden in the residence. She didn't want to be seen in the Oval Office. I finally got Jeff Zients, the chief of staff, to confirm this reluctantly for me. Anyway, she had this heart-to-heart with Biden, and she sat down and she later told a friend, not in a boasting way, but just a matter of, I was the only one who could send this message. He trusts me. They had a lot of history, shared Catholic faith, all of that. She felt, even though Biden didn't budge in that meeting, she felt that she'd gotten through.
And Jill in all of this?
And Jill, look, the most telling, revealing moment with Jill Biden, in my opinion, was minutes after the debate, that ill-fated debate, June 27th, the disastrous debate, when they went back to the Atlanta hotel and she said on a stage like this in front of bewildered supporters, she said, you did just great. You answered every question. You are amazing. We don't know what their private conversations were, but Jill has always been there, supportive of essentially whatever Joe wanted to do. Joe wanted to run again. Joe never had any intention of passing the baton to a younger generation, in spite of that famous remark he made about a bridge.
Is that true?
Yes, never had any intention. I sat down with.
You have that, you're certain of that.
I'm certain of that. And I'm certain of it because, among other sources, I spoke to his closest friend in the world, Ted Kaufman. Kaufman assumed Biden's Senate seat when Joe became vice president. They rode on Amtrak 1,000,000 miles. They talk every day. Kaufman told me there was never any conversation about passing it, ever. And he just said emphatically, he was elected president. You run for a second term, period, end of story. That was his take.
You also take us into what was going on in Kamala Harris's world prior to Biden stepping down, and make the also unreported revelation that despite her public display of supporting Biden, she was actually already planning her candidacy.
So Kamala Harris was in a really delicate position. I mean, she was navigating a minefield in which the slightest misstep would have been politically fatal. Any hint that she was breaking from Biden or planning to become plotting to become the nominee would have been disastrous. So she was like Caesar's wife. She was incredibly supportive. She was saying all the right things. But privately, what I learned behind the scenes, she had reached out to Democratic operatives who could not be traced back to her campaign, very important. And they went to work looking at every aspect of this, looking at the rules, making sure that they knew exactly what to do the moment Biden stepped aside, and also reaching out to some senators and telling them that they needed to withdraw their support for Biden. I don't think she knew, there's no evidence that she knew the phone call was coming when it did that Sunday, but she was expecting it. And the moment it happened, she had a political machine that just sprang into action. They gathered around her dining room table, working the phones, the laptops. Within 48 hours, she had the nomination nailed down.
Was she that confident that when and if Biden stepped down, he would point to her?
No, I don't think she was. And in fact, I report phone call that they had, but it's been reported in one of those other books, one of them, that Biden told her he was stepping aside. She said, no. She said, are you sure? Are you really sure? And then Biden said he was, and he said nothing about an endorsement. And she said, well, what about an endorsement? And he hedged, and he obfuscated, and it wasn't until he called back later to say, I'm putting out your endorsement.
And was that so putting your student of politics hat on, was that the right move at that point?
It was the only move. There was no other option. And there was, by this time, we're talking about July 21st, there was no time for a quote unquote mini primary or anything else of its kind. And she was the obvious, really only choice when you consider that she'd been vice president. The Democratic base was largely African American. There was just no chance that anybody else would. So the real question would be, why not 2 years earlier or a year earlier? Just to reinforce the point I just made, I talked to people high up in the Democratic National Committee who were baffled that Pelosi and Obama thought there could be some kind of mini primary. It could not have happened. It was impossible. The rules were such, and the money, from the campaign would have gone to Harris in any event. So the real question is, why not a year or two earlier for Biden to step aside?
Well, and you kind of explained that to us. The echo chamber that he was existing in was telling him everything was swell, apparently, or at least no one was telling him things weren't swell.
Yeah. No, nobody is, I spoke to Leon Panetta, who is one of my favorite people, and certainly in the political world, very wise. And I asked him, about this. He said it was just, he felt that it was a failure of leadership across the party, but really starting in that inner circle. And of course, when I wrote my book on the White House Chiefs of Staff, the Gatekeepers, Panetta was one of the people who told me that, look, the job is to walk into the Oval Office, close the door, and tell the president what he doesn't want to hear. He said, in this case, there was no grown-up in the room, as he put it, no grown-up in the room who looked Biden in the eye and said, what the blank are you doing?
So, in a post-mortem about the election held at Harvard, one of the participants you write about this said that Harris ran, and I'm quoting, a nearly flawless campaign. That is not how you saw it.
No, I didn't. And I also don't think it was unwinnable. There's a school of thought that there was a powerful worldwide rejection of incumbents. There's something since COVID struck, 50 out of 64 incumbents were swept away, regardless of political party. That this was, some people say this was an irresistible tide. She could not have overcome.
Right.
I don't think that's true. It came down to 7 battlefield states. It was reasonably close. And I think the real, plenty of mistakes, but the major one in my view, and it wasn't easy for her to do this, but she had to be a change candidate in a change election as the sitting vice president of the United States. How do you do that? Not easy.
Well, but she failed miserably. The performance on The View, among other things.
Well, and here's the huge irony of that. Some of you may remember she was on the ABC show The View. She was asked the question that she knew was coming. Everybody knew was coming. What would you do? How would you govern differently from Joe Biden? That softball right over the plate, and she whiffed completely.
Yeah, think of it.
She said, I can't think of a single thing. Within hours, that was a devastating Trump campaign commercial running in I don't know how many states. So here's the big irony of that. her chief of staff, Lorraine Bowles, and Jen O'Malley Dillon, the co-chair of the campaign, had gone to the White House, sat down with Joe Biden's chief of staff, Jeff Zients, and said, hey, in effect, asked for permission. We said, we need to win this thing. We're going to have to break with the president on some issues. And he said, go for it, do it. You do what you have to do.
So she had permission
And Joe,
to trash him, but to say, yeah, look, I mean, maybe we do this differently, that differently, whatever.
so in 1968, the wildest campaign before this one, with two actual assassinations, and all kinds of craziness. But Hubert Humphrey broke with Lyndon Johnson on the conduct of the Vietnam War very late in that campaign. It was in October, and he had a surge. I mean, he was behind by something like 10 points. It wound up being a photo finish, and so, close is no cigar. But and could Kamala have said, when asked that question on The View, okay, I'm proud of my record. We've done A, B, C, and D, but you know what? We blew it on inflation. And here's what I'm going to do. And here's how we solve it. Would that have helped if she kept beating that drum and
How about we blew it on immigration?
or immigration too? I mean, I think that was a lost cause by then for her, because she was so closely identified as the quote unquote border czar
Yeah.
that she wasn't going to convince anybody that she was tough on immigration.
But maybe, I wish we'd done it differently.
Yeah.
Because by the end, they were doing it differently and the numbers had started to fall. So I don't know. I mean, whoever knows. And now we're sort of but I'm very interested in what the higher ups in the Democratic Party had to say to you about the flaws in the campaign. It seems, we're reporting, that the whole celebrity endorsement thing backfired to some extent.
Well, I spoke to this is one of the great stories in the book. I think it's Susie Wiles, Donald Trump's now chief of staff, White House chief of staff, but campaign manager, campaign chair. She's got this, and I'll get around to your answer in a second, but she's got this kind of magic with Trump. She's able to impose some discipline on this otherwise completely undisciplined character. And a lot of it, I think, goes back to her relationship with her father, Pat Summerall, the famous sportscaster who was also an alcoholic. She learned how to deal with difficult men. She'd be the first to tell you that as the child of an alcoholic, she knows what you can control and what you can't. Trump is not an alcoholic, but he's addicted to power and money and fame. Anyway, not to play psychologist any longer, but she told me, Susie Wiles did, first of all, that they never had any doubt that they would win. Second,
And you believed her.
as she put it, I believed her. And second, she said, we couldn't believe how bad she was. She's referring now to Kamala Harris. She told me all of this on the record.
And what in particular did she point to?
She thought that the campaign did with Kamala Harris what it had done with Joe Biden in 2020, namely hiding him in the basement. She felt that the Harris campaign essentially hid Kamala Harris. And coming out of the convention, for example, there was a period of a few weeks where she didn't do any interviews. Of course, she passed on the Joe Rogan interview that was so effective for Trump. Susie Wiles felt that they were hiding her because they knew she wasn't up to it. She would make mistakes. And in her view, her performance on The View was Exhibit A.
So one of the big factors in the outcome of the election was the swing of young men from, what was it, sort of 15% for Biden in 2020 to 15% for Trump this time around. That's a 30-point swing. So could she have done something to have prevented that swing?
Well, it's hard to know for sure, but Trump was able to exploit this alternative world of non-mainstream media, his podcasts, Joe Rogan in particular, and that really changed those numbers for him. She did not. She was unable to tap into that same kind of network, and that cost her.
Yeah, I mean, you write in detail, and she was going to do Joe Rogan, and she wasn't going to do Joe Rogan, and there was a whole thing. Maybe then she was going to do Joe Rogan remotely because she couldn't get to where he was. It was a bad call. So, I'm getting more and more depressed by the moment. Actually, there's a fabulous, you won't see this too often on a book jacket, but there's a fabulous quote on the back of the jacket. Priebus, who is Trump's former chief of staff, gave his incoming chief of staff, Susie Wells, the following advice: don't talk to Whipple.
Finally, a little bit of campaign comedy.
Yeah, Susie Wild did not follow that advice. She did talk to you.
It was actually, can I tell you the quick backstory on that? So what happened was, in the Gatekeepers, the first chapter, actually it opens with one of these traditional get-togethers where the outgoing White House chief of staff invites the incoming White House chief of staff, regardless of party, to come and get advice from all the ex-chiefs, and then gather in the chief's office. And anyway, I wrote about this in the Gatekeepers. Well, Jeffrey Zients, the outgoing chief this time, invited Susie Wiles to his house, and a bunch of ex-chiefs. 8 of them sat around this table, and they all went around giving their advice to Susie. And when they got to Reince, he said, "Don't talk to Whipple." And I asked Susie about this later, and she said, "Yeah, I think Reince had just come from the bar." She's quite, go figure. I mean, she's quite funny. She's candid, and you just want to ask her, what are you doing with this guy?
Well, okay, so now that's my question. Based upon all the people who you have talked to, who you continue to talk to, including Susie, what the hell is going on? It seems like chaos. It seems like chaos. Is it chaos?
Yes, it's chaos, and my view has always been that there is no new Trump. New Trump, same as the old Trump. He's never understood the difference between campaigning and governing. Ken Duberstein, who was Ronald Reagan's last chief of staff, told me once that when campaigning, you destroy your opponent. Governing, and this, I apologize for this image, you make love to your opponent. Trump has never understood that. He understands he has one gear, and that is, he has a feral genius for campaigning, great instincts, but no idea how to govern, and that hasn't changed. So that's why you're seeing there's no 4-dimensional chess going on here. Trust me, the tariff thing is not a grand strategy. He went off the cliff with the flag flying with this idiot Navarro, and then Susie Wiles and Musk had to reel him back in. That's the way policy happens in this White House. There's no, and this idea that he's a new Trump who knows just what he's doing is, in my view, wrong.
And so what do you make of the, maybe some of you have also seen these comments that Bill Maher has made after his dinner at the White House, saying, among other things, that he's much more self-aware than he lets on in public. And then he said, a crazy person does not live in the White House.
Roll my eyes. I'm sorry, but the fact that Trump was courteous and nice to Bill Maher over lunch doesn't change anything in my view. I mean, that's just nonsense. The idea, we all know that Trump is a charmer. He can be one-on-one. That doesn't explain the current state of affairs, in my view.
So today, the New York Times, many of you may have seen this as well, a poll done in March. So before tariffs really took hold, before the market crashed and crashed and may soon crash again. The poll taken of voters said that 71% of Republicans as of March identify as MAGA.
Wow.
yeah, it's, that's where we are. My book is an attempt to explain how we got here.
So how do we get out of
And I
here?
don't know if I. This is what you get when you ask Cynthia McFadden to. When you're dumb enough to ask Cynthia McFadden to interview you, you're gonna get the tough questions.
Well, I mean, in fact, you have probably talked to more people on both sides than just about any other American. So at this point, surely you have some answers for us. What's
Surely,
Surely.
don't call me Shirley. So, look, I think there's another poll that fascinates me, and that is that Joe Biden had, this was about a month or two ago, Joe Biden had a 39% approval rating post-presidency. I'll bet it's a lot lower right now as a result of the beating that he's been taking from my book and the other one. And there's another one by your favorite guy, Jake Tapper, coming out. Actually, he's not. I thought
That'll be in my book.
this is off the record, right? This whole event.
I think nothing is off the record.
So, I'm fascinated by that poll because, and also the fact that Joe Biden's giving a speech in Chicago tonight. And I'm really curious to see what happens. I think that, and it's a two-part answer to your question. What about Biden's legacy at this point? I think, as I said earlier, I think it's a tragedy. I think this is a guy who was a consequential president, or certainly on his way to being one. Had enormous, pulled the economy out of a free fall, presided over, dealt with the pandemic, passed more bipartisan legislation than anybody since FDR, grappled with global warming, did a lot of good things. It ended because of this fatal flaw, this terrible mistake of not facing reality and looking clear-eyed at the fact that he was as old as he is. I think it's not only a tragedy, but it's a scandal. I think that the people around Joe Biden are going to be like Haldeman and Ehrlichman and some of Nixon's aides, permanently unemployable in government. And I think that as far as the future of the Democratic Party goes, I think that whoever it is that emerges as a leader is going to have to be clear that that was unacceptable, because we now have corruption at both ends of the spectrum. We have it with Trump, we all know that. But I think this was corrupt too. I think the fact that I was on with Steve Schmidt on the podcast the other day, and Schmidt was giving me a hard time about how, this was not benign. And I'm not saying it was benign in any way. This delusion and denial came at a huge price for not just Joe Biden's legacy, but the future of the Democratic Party, the fate of this country and the world. And I think that whoever emerges is going to have to it's going to have to be clear about that. It probably will be someone who is, the Democratic Party has a lot of talent, and it's a really deep bench. There's some really good ones. Wes Moore, Whitmer before she went to the Oval, and others. But I'm really interested to see how Chris Murphy. Yep. AOC and Bernie are out there getting huge crowds because they speak very clearly. Yeah, the anti-oligarch tour, I love it. So long-winded answer to your question. We don't know who it is, who will step forward at this point, but we didn't know much about Obama either at this stage. We didn't really know that Obama was going to emerge at this stage of that race.
They're dying to ask some questions. Now, let me just say before you do, Chris and Harry have moved to show you what good judgment they have. They have moved to the shoreline. So this is your neighbor.
It's thrilled to be here.
Anyone who asks a weird question will just, it's not neighborly, so sorry.
Chris, how do you explain extraordinary difference from Biden's successful State of the Union address to the Trump debate. I mean,
Maybe it was Spielberg.
Wasn't that?
Teleprompter?
It's a real mystery. It's hard to explain how he was capable of delivering that performance. It was on teleprompter. But in the moment when he was heckled,
Yep.
that was not
Right.
scripted in any way, and he owned it. So he was capable. That's what makes this so fascinating and such a mystery at the heart of the book, I think, is the fact that we don't really have a clear answer to that. Maybe it was just deterioration, decline between the State of the Union and the debate. It could well be.
Or, when you get older, I don't know, I find my performance varies day to day. Sorry.
Thank you. I love the Gatekeepers, and I reread the end of it when you wrote about Reince Priebus, John Kelly, and I'm very much interested in, do you think Susie Wiles will last? Because they couldn't take it anymore.
Great question. The answer is yes, I think she will. I think she has a kind of magic with Trump and maybe a threshold for pain. Maybe a really high threshold for pain. But he trusts her in a way that he never trusted any of her predecessors.
From the outside, it's really hard to see that she's having much of a leavening effect, however.
No, she's not. Well, I was saying to somebody earlier today that, there are a couple of, obviously, several aspects to the job. What she has succeeded in doing is, I think, making the White House run efficiently.
Mhm.
It's not, it's not, all hell breaking loose every day the way it was under Priebus and the rest of that gang. And part of that is because people know that she speaks for Trump. People know that when she opens her mouth, she's speaking for Trump. They never felt that way about any of her predecessors. So that's part of the job. But the other more important part of the job is telling the president what he doesn't want to hear. I will tell you what she told me about that. I said to her at one point early on, did it ever occur to you to say to the president, you know what? Maybe we should look at these January 6 cases individually instead of doing a blanket pardon, get out of jail free card? And she said, that's exactly what I told him, she claims. They had this conversation. She said, I lost this one. He ultimately sort of persuaded me that even though some were more egregious than others, they all got more time than the prosecution had recommended. It was a kind of a lame answer, but she lost that one. And she said, look, a tie goes to the president. She's losing a lot of bouts. There's no doubt about it. And I think she'll be judged, a couple of things. You may or may not believe her, but that were encouraging. I said, is he going to obey the courts? Bottom line, will he obey the courts?
And
She said, he will obey the courts. So you can believe her, or not. You can
Well,
believe her or not.
it is just not very comforting when the speaker then says, just remember who funds the federal court, the federal government.
Yeah.
A little threat. Yes, my friend.
Hi, Chris, thank you so much for this. It's an incredible conversation. Given you shared with us how chaotic the White House is, which really tracks, I think, from just watching it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your perspective is on the roles of Stephen Miller, Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, and for fun, I'll throw in Steve Bannon. There are all these corridors who have huge agendas and huge ambitions, and it's impossible to see from where we sit who's got the most influence. So I'm wondering if in your conversations with Susie, you have any perspective on those dynamics, or if they're all chaotic.
Well, I can tell you that she has her hands full with Musk, that's for sure. She called him in on the carpet, or tried to, when he, in one fell swoop, destroyed USAID. She said to him, really? Wait a minute. She said, you're really gonna fire all these people? The vaccines in Africa, for God's sake. They had that conversation. She's trying to restrain Musk to the extent that she can, not obviously having a whole lot of success. Stephen Miller, I think, is really influential. Trump really likes him. Bannon, yeah, not so much. I mean, I think Bannon is still on the outs. He's a rabble rouser and, he's useful in his way, but he's not in Trump's ear. I don't think. And, is there somebody else?
JD Vance / Peter Thiel.
Yeah, Vance. JD Vance, it's early. It's early to tell. I mean, I think the three most powerful people in this administration are Trump, Musk, and Susie Wiles.
Feel better?
We're talking about Kamala and her identity during the 3-week window after she got the nomination. What do you think she could have done differently to be more effective in terms of not necessarily going to the other media or anything like that, but to create an identity that people could go forward?
I think that was one of the central problems of the campaign. It was a Biden campaign that never ultimately became a Harris campaign. And part of that could well be that everybody in the campaign running it, they were Biden people. They were wedded to and proud of Biden's record. And so they had a huge challenge. They had to create her identity and introduce her to 350 million people yesterday. And when, in fact, one of her aides told me that, Biden dropped out on July 21, on July 22, everybody was reading her book, trying to figure out who is she. They had to introduce her, and it's not an easy thing to do. I don't know how you all felt. I thought she really didn't put a foot wrong through the convention. She was really good. Coming out of the convention, I think certainly the Trump campaign felt that she lost her momentum, lost her footing, didn't do interviews for a couple of weeks, claimed that the press was unfair and it was a double standard because Trump wasn't doing interviews with the mainstream media. Excuses. That she sort of went silent. She lost her momentum coming out of the convention during a really critical period.
Why did she do that? Why did she lose it? Why did she not do it?
Well, if you were to ask the Trump campaign, their theory would be that they were hiding her in the same way. Well, yes, I tell you, I think they were. I think that my experience with the Biden White House was that it was the most controlling, battened down, scripted place I'd ever seen, and afraid to let Biden open his mouth. And I think some of those people were running the Harris campaign. They were risk averse. They were afraid that she would step in it if she opened her mouth, is my gut feeling.
And I guess the conclusion is things might have been better if she'd even made a few mistakes, but been more authentic, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yes.
If given the opportunity, would you like to interview Musk?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, listen, you don't have to like your subject, your interviewee.
Oh, it's much more fun when you don't.
So yeah, I would do it. And Susie has said, come on down and, she'll give me the run of the place, but I wasn't ready for that.
Yeah, that's the next book. Yes.
Hi, in your conversations, I'm in the medical field, so I don't know if anybody would release this kind of information, but he obviously had, I think, a medically, physically declining condition, whether it's neurological, maybe shuffling gait. So I did wonder if anyone talked about behind the scenes, did they have a thorough exam, mental exam, like, was there something medically going on? And sometimes you'd see him with eyes completely wide open, other times they were completely shut, like, was he getting injected? But they talked all about what they were doing
Well, no, I'm
medically.
fascinated to hear your description, what was going through your mind as you watched it. And because we just don't know at this point. There's no, you know, I'd be the first to say that if someone can produce a failed neurological exam or a deep six Parkinson's diagnosis or something I'm not aware, I would salute them. You know, if Jake Tapper's got it, more power to him.
Wow.
I don't think anybody does. I do not think so. And one of the explanations for his gait is that he had a hairline fracture in his foot and he refused to wear a boot that he was supposed to wear. That was
Lame, sorry.
That was
Being a
supposedly-
neurological person, he had
was
something-
supposedly the
Yeah.
explanation for
Yeah,
that.
it's
Maybe
not
that's garbage. But that was the excuse there.
Did he take neurological exams, do you know?
I just don't know.
I don't think that,
I don't think they
oh,
were.
good, they're on, well,
Yeah, well.
so I think if they had, they would have uncovered something, especially the thing about the mentation, when someone has completely very wide wait times and very almost like I mean, there was something going on there. I was just wondering if anybody would.
I'll tell you what
Remember that
Ron Klein told me about the moment. For me, it was the most striking moment of the debate. It was about 12 minutes in. He was asked a totally unrelated question, and he looked like he was lost. And he stopped, and he couldn't get his sentence out. And he finally said, "We finally beat Medicare."
Right.
Remember?
Yeah, yeah,
For
finding
me, that was the moment when I thought he was having a stroke.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought about this, yeah.
You know, so Ron Klein's explanation of that is that the stutter, which goes way back, as you know, whatever that condition is called medically, I'm not sure. But anyway, he has this congenital condition that caused him to stutter. He's worked on it his whole life. Klein says there's an auditory processing delay, and that's what you were seeing in that moment when he looked so lost. It takes, there's a lag in comprehending that question. But I don't know that would explain
I don't buy
the
it.
nonsense answer he gave.
Right,
So
it wasn't there 3 years ago.
that was Klein's explanation.
So,
I have the twofold question. Going forward, wouldn't it be a good idea for someone like Chris Murphy to get on board with the Bernie and AOC type train? And with all the protests that are starting to happen now? Because we've seen very little succession planning in the new Democratic Party. And I think maybe people have to start to make up their minds earlier because we realize it's going to take longer to create the image of what the new party is going to be. So that's number one. And number two, what do you think is the influence of the online news sources that are non-commercial media like Midas Touch and Cohen and Mark Alliance and all these other guys who are out there now talking and more people are getting their news from, the online.
I might throw that second question to Cynthia, but the answer to the first question, she knows much more about that world than I do. But the answer to your first question, I don't know. I wish Dick Blumenthal were here. He was going to join us tonight. Maybe he'd have an opinion about Murphy and how he's doing. I think Murphy's been great. I think he's been out there. He's been really vocal. I think that's what's called for right now. And whether or not he agrees with Bernie Sanders and AOC, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that that's the path, but it's got to be a path. It's between the Biden history and Trump, obviously. And I think he's doing great.
I'm just wondering, all of these, clearly leaders of the Democratic Party, if any of them express to you any regret, any remorse, any recognition that they helped lead the country into the current situation.
No, I think that's a great question, and the answer is no. No one has, and that's why I was really interested in the fact that Biden was giving a speech tonight, and I really want to hear what he has to say, because I don't think he's self-aware enough to even acknowledge this beating that he's been taking lately, or rightly, in my view. That's easy for me to say, but
But for the party to rise again, doesn't there have to be some kind of recognition, some sort of come to the wall here and understand what went wrong so it doesn't go wrong again?
yeah, no, I think there has to be a reckoning, and I really agree with that.
So if you had to choose between Trump being like an egotistical, narcissistic psychopath.
His bar is pretty low. Yeah.
A wannabe dictator. Which
Or what?
would it be?
Or
All of this.
But he's all of the above, right? You just described, yeah, right?
His own sense, or do you think he just wants all the glory for, the history books? Like, do you think he wants to walk away with the biggest pile of cash?
Yeah, I've had this discussion with a friend of mine who's a banker, who's convinced that, Trump is all about money, and I disagree. I think it's about attention. I think it's narcissism. I think it's attention. I think it's the applause. I think it's his place in history. I'm sort of with Michael Wolff on this. I think it's all about the attention and the applause and being the center of every conversation at all times.
you also report, which is stunning, that little office off the Oval Office, which presidents have long used for private meetings, is now the swag room. That's where you can get your MAGA hat.
So how does he prove that the numbers go the wrong way?
One more question. We have millions of questions.
Well, his approval rating is actually the highest it's ever been for Trump.
You had alluded earlier to the fact that Trump will comply with the courts. But
According to
looking-
Susie, yeah.
Well, okay, well, looking at AP still not being allowed into events, Sundays, CBS, Greenland, Ukrainian peace and the threats that have been made. How do you feel that is going to move in the future? One, and number two, as a person that's highly involved with media, where do you personally feel in terms of your exposure?
I'm not sure I understand the last part of the question.
In terms of the potential of you being on the block now.
Oh, okay.
ICE agents are coming to.
What was the first part of the question? I'll answer the first part. The first part, I think, is, you could argue that Susie Wiles has already been proved wrong because he's fighting the courts every inch of the way, and he has been. He's been obstructing and claiming that, facilitating the Supreme Court called for him to facilitate the return of the innocent guy in Salvador, and they're having none of that, and they're fighting every inch of the way, and J.D. Vance is suggesting they won't obey the courts. But I still think that at the end of the day, they're not going to defy flatly, well, Susie is saying, I shouldn't say I believe this, but Susie claims that he's not going to flout, just flat out disobey in order to the Supreme Court. So you can take that for whatever it's worth. And
So
I don't worry too much about being, in the pokey. Maybe I should worry more. I think they're actually loving all the stuff about Biden. I mean, I was on Fox with Jesse Waters the other night, who's pretty outrageous, and all they wanted to hear were the Biden stories, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but the book was number 100 something that evening, and in the morning I woke up, it was number 4.
you feel guilty about that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're out of time,
Congratulations, you're part of it.
The group meetings. One more question. Do we have one really good? Oh, right there, sir.
Okay, given the midterms coming up in a couple of years, do you think that there will be a change? Will it be the same, or do you think that maybe the Republicans will start to make a change in some?
No, I think Trump is Trump, same as the old Trump. Trump is not going to chasten. Trump is going to do what he wants to do, unless somebody like Susie Wiles talks him out of it. So, no, I don't expect any adjustment. I expect them to go right off the cliff in the midterm.
And would he have won if he hadn't been shot?
Susie Wiles is convinced he would have won. I think he would have won.
Backlash of the midterms.
There almost always is, and I think there will be this time.
Thank you all so much for coming.